Howdy doody, buckaroonies. I feel like it's time we talk about something and get it out in the open here. For whatever reason, society tends to not acknowledge the problems that musicians and producers face. Like, I don't know about you, but I'm constantly having to ask myself things like, where am I going to park my Lamborghini in between my piles of cocaine? And what am I going to do with all these strippers? And what should I spend my endless piles of money on? I mean, really, it's just ridiculous. Seriously though, like a lot of you, I've got a budget, and I can't be blowing money on stuff that's just unnecessary or not worth the investment, especially when it comes to plugins. There are tons and tons of plugins out there, especially in the world of free plugins. It's just kind of endless. But when it comes to paid plugins, you always have to ask yourself for a moment, is this plugin really worth the money? In this video, I wanted to share with you 5 of my favorite cheap plugins that I think are well worth the investment due to how unique or all-around useful they are, and some things that will really actually add something to your setup, all without breaking the bank. If you've got some recommendations on great cheap plugins, be sure to leave those down in the comments, and if you want to check out any of the plugins from today's video, you can find them all linked down in the description below. First up is Bass XL from Denise. This is a bass enhancement plugin similar to something like the classic Waves R-Bass. This actually comes in at only about $35. Waves R-Bass, on the other hand, on sale is pretty cheap, but normally is about $80. However, Bass XL does offer a few extra features that I personally find really handy. Bass XL is a bass enhancement plugin, so it doesn't generate new sonic information, but it does enhance what is already there. This is really useful for sound design purposes, like making your kick drums have some nice meaty low end. It can add some beef to a bass. You can use it to get kind of a cool movie trailer guy voice if you want to go that way, or just adding some general thickness and weight to whatever needs it in your mix, and does it in a very nice, transparent way. The plugin itself is incredibly simple to use. We've got the mix knob here, which blends in the amount of bass enhancement going on. We've got an input and output gain here, allowing us to boost things in and then compensate after the fact as needed. We've got the frequency control here, which sets the target frequency to start enhancing. This goes all the way down to 20 hertz, which is really, really, really low, and all the way up to 320 hertz, which can also be good for adding just kind of some body to things if maybe your vocal feels a little thin or whatever, or maybe an acoustic guitar or something like that. So it's actually useful for more than just bass enhancement. Then we've got the drive and tone shapers here. This is probably my favorite feature of this plugin. The drive adds some gentle drive that enhances even more harmonic information, and the tone allows you to shape it, but we'll demonstrate that here in a minute. Finally, we've got the link down here. We've got a filter, so this controls the crossover filter. Then we've got the position control, which we'll demonstrate shortly, and then you can solo it out to hear exactly what it's doing, which we'll demonstrate right now. Here, I've prepared a couple examples to show this thing on. So first up, here are a couple of kick drums, and we're going to bypass the plugin for now, and these sound a little bit wimpy. So, not bad kicks, but you know, they might use a little more beef to them. Let's bring in Bass XL here and start playing with it. And right there, we've gone from kind of lame, flat kicks to some really beefy, punchy kicks. Let's solo this out. So this is soloing only what's going on with the plugin. Let's try and increase the crossover to 24 decibels per octave. This way we can isolate just down to the super low end. Let's open the tone and bring in some more drive. So see, we're starting to get into kind of soft clipper territory, but only on the low end. Or we can go totally neutral and clean. Now the cool thing is this position control, which we can enable with this button. So this allows us to offset the enhanced stuff by a couple of milliseconds, either positive or negative. And this is really useful because sometimes with bass enhancement plugins, you get this kind of weird smear to things and it can kind of goof your transients a little bit. So this allows us to push the enhanced bass stuff a little bit out of the way of the transient, which is really great for kick design. So now we've got nice punchy kicks. We don't lose that snap to them, but then we get that kind of weight and meat to it a little bit after the fact. A couple other quick demonstrations here. I've got a synth bass line and it sounds like this. in bass XL. Before and after. As another example, I've got kind of a funky bass line and some drum breaks here. Which sounds good, but it doesn't really have any weight to it. So let's start bringing in bass XL on the bass first. Let's bring it in on the drums. So really, really great way to thicken out a mix and just add some low end to things that need it. As a final example here, I've got kind of a cool synth sequence from Vital, which already sounds pretty modern and stuff, but it might need a bit of weight. So we can bring in a bit of bass XL. So before and after. And that's really it for this one. I think when it comes to bass enhancement plugins, this is pretty much as straightforward as it gets. It does exactly what you think it would do, but it also has enough parameters and flexibility to be a really useful tool in a lot of different situations. Next up, we've got Spaced Out from Baby Audio. This is a reverb and delay combination plugin, and it comes in at $69. So, Spaced Out here is a relatively new plugin, and it is one I find myself reaching for way too much ever since I've gotten a hold of it. It just sounds really, really good. Spaced Out is a combination of a delay and a reverb. On the left side, we've got the delay. The delay's got 4 modes: straight, 2x, dotted, and triplet. This grid is the delay taps. We've got 16 different delay taps you can also generate to get different delay rhythms and echoes, which is super, super fun and really inspiring to mess with and just generate a couple times and see what you get. We've got 4 different modes. We've got clean, tape, hazy, and lo-fi. Dimension, which just makes things a bit more spacey and washy. Intensity. Sustain brings up the sustain. Feedback control here, and then a filter. In the center panel here, we've got the XY control to blend between dry and wet. Then we can bias towards the left for delay, bias towards the right for reverb, or go somewhere in between. Ducker and sync here, so we can duck things out of the way or sync them up as needed. Lift off, which is kind of something like OTT, where it just expands everything and lifts up all the crispy, glittery bits, and an output control here to control the output level if needed. On the reverb side, we've got 4 modes: vacuum, which is super small, small space, medium space, and outer space. Outer space being the biggest, washiest mode. Then we've got an XY controller here, which blends between the length and then 4 different effects. We've got cosmic, lush, trippy, and alien. So this is chorus, phaser, flanger, and I believe a something else, maybe over on the reverb side, we've got 4 different modes here: vacuum, small space, medium space, and outer space. Going left to right, that is the smallest to the most big and washiest. Then we've got an XY controller here, which blends between 4 different effects, as well as controlling the length of the reverb. So we've got cosmic, lush, trippy, and alien. So this is cool because it adds some modulation and movement with chorus, phaser, flanger, things like that, and makes the reverb tails just really interesting and evolving. So this is really more biased towards big, spacey reverbs and stuff. Pre-delay control, Stardust, which lifts up the high end, I believe, a bit. A filter here, cleanup, which cleans up the later stages of the reverb, I think just cleaning up the low end mostly. And a width control. So all in all, a pretty good amount of controls without getting excessive. Spaced Out sounds really damn good and is really worth buying, and to prove it, I've got an instance of Vital here, just an initial saw wave and a low pass filter, so the patch sounds like this. Boring. Now, let's bring in Spaced Out here. So I've got this blended, mostly wet. We've got a lot of delay and a big washy reverb, so that takes that same patch and turns it into this. So a really lovely washy reverb for ambient and things along those lines, or just adding some huge, I mean, we're still going here, huge epic spaces to pads, vocals, whatever you want to put it on, but it does work in more of a not so ridiculous context. For an example of something not so ridiculous, I've got this on Piano Tech here, so this is mostly dry. It's a medium space, not super long and not super crazy, and then just a really basic echo here. Let's maybe randomize that a few times just for the sake of doing that, and let's see what we've got. So before spaced out is applied, we've got this. And after we bring that in, it becomes this. So as a utility reverb, it's also pretty useful. It's not really something you would find yourself maybe putting on like a snare drum or something like that, where it just needs a little bit of room to it. But when it comes to adding a nice, very musical sounding, very lush, interesting reverb and or delay combination, this is a great plugin that I really think you should own. Okay, just cutting in here for a minute. I don't know about you, but I have a pretty bad case of shiny object syndrome, so I have a bit of a problem when it comes to plugins. I tend to buy a lot of plugins that I don't end up using, or I end up buying a plugin that ends up entirely replacing another plugin that I paid a bunch of money for, and then that sits on my hard drive gathering a bunch of digital dust. Now, unlike the world of hardware stuff, it's not necessarily straightforward to buy and sell used plugins, but that is where the sponsor of today's video, KnobCloud, the service with a funny name and a pretty good idea, comes in. KnobCloud is an online marketplace for buying and selling used plugins. You can even find many of the plugins featured in today's video there, often at a pretty steep discount, which is nice because it's like having access to plugins that are always on sale. Using KnobCloud is super straightforward. You sign up for an account, you list your plugins you want to get rid of, you take your money, you can buy some new plugins, you could finance your next big gear purchase, or you could buy a bunch of hamburgers. It's really entirely up to you. KnobCloud previously sponsored a video on the channel, and I know afterwards a few of you got in touch with me, as well as the creator of KnobCloud, admittedly with a pretty mixed reaction, but the platform was just kind of starting out at the time, so some improvements were definitely needed. However, the creator of KnobCloud got in touch with me and wanted to sponsor today's video for me to let everyone know that they've made a ton of improvements to the overall platform, as well as the buying and selling experience to make all of this better for everyone. KnobCloud, as far as I'm aware, is an entirely one-person operation, so I think this is actually a pretty impressive effort, and I think it's really awesome that they're listening to feedback to help improve everything going forward, because I do wish KnobCloud a lot of success. I think it's a great idea, and I think it's a really cool service, and I think it's a great way to get rid of the stuff we've all gathered over the years that just sits there collecting dust, so that we can upgrade and buy more plugins that we may or may not actually end up using. If you want to check out KnobCloud for yourself to get rid of some of your old plugins that you don't use anymore, or maybe pick up some of the plugins from today's video at a pretty good discount, you can find more information over at knobcloud.com. Next on my list is Sketch Cassette 2 from Aberrant DSP. Believe it or not, I think this is actually one of the best investments I have ever made in a plugin. It is super useful and is one of my kind of favorite secret weapons, and it's only 30 bucks. As the name would imply, Sketch Cassette 2 is designed to bring the sound of a crappy cassette to whatever you put it on, or just add a little bit of that cassette mojo and flavor. This is very much in the vein of something like RC20, but again is biased more towards the idea of a cassette. The great thing about this plugin, I think, is that it has so many different presets, and they're all really useful, so you don't even have to mess with it. You can flick through a couple presets, and one of them is bound to work. It goes from very, very subtle to incredibly, like, dragged my cassette across the concrete and put it back in, and then spooled it up and gave it a play. So this is a really useful plugin, but I think the great thing though is when you do really want to dive in, there are a ton of different parameters. It even works as a compressor. It's super, super cool. And I find it's really hard to get a bad sound out of this. Whatever you put it on, it just makes it sound more gooder. There are a couple different types here, type 1, 2, and 3, with a couple of modes each. We can also bypass this and just use some of the other controls. We've got controls for hiss, saturation, the age, the depth of the dropouts, and the intensity of the dropouts, or kind of the little blank spots, wow, and flutter, which is the wooble and wibble and wobble, the offset, the flanging and stuff. We've got mixes for the tape and compression, the compensation and everything. It's just a really useful, really flexible plugin. So to demonstrate the sound of this thing, first up, I wanted to demonstrate this on kind of a Wurlitzer sound, so just an electric piano more or less. So without anything applied, it sounds like this. Now, once we bring Sketch Cassette into the mix, that takes that same sound and turns it into this. For another demonstration, let's flick through a couple presets here, and I'm going to play this now on that same Vital pad from earlier running into Spaced Out. So we're going to run this on a big epic synth pad, and it's going to sound really cool. To wiggle a couple parameters here. And that is the magic of Sketch Cassette 2. I think this is easily one of my favorite plugins, and for 30 bucks, I don't think you can beat it. I think this is probably one of the coolest paid plugins out there that's really not going to break the bank. You should absolutely check it out. It's great for adding a little bit of crunch and hiss, but it's great if you do sound design at all and maybe you need to make some lo-fi stuff. It's a great tool for that and adding that kind of vibe and mojo, but it's also good for just adding a bit of texture and interest to things. I find myself reaching for this a lot on pads and ambient layers and other little things, or even just on a drum bus or a piano or something, and just a really subtle amount can add this nice movement and interest to things and give it a little bit more character, especially if you're working a lot with samples or things that don't really sound too alive. It's a great way to inject a little bit of that nostalgia factor and movement and interest to your tracks. Next up is Disperser from Kilohertz, which is a pretty hard plugin to explain until you've heard it. I'm a very big fan of the Kilohertz plugins, as you may or may not know, and this, I think, is one of their most interesting plugins, and it's pretty cheap at only $59. Disperser is an incredibly useful sound design tool, but also a really handy mixing aid. It's kind of like a bass enhancement plugin, but it's also kind of like a weird goofifying plugin and a lot of interesting stuff in between, and there's not really anything else on the market that does what this does. There are some ways to kind of fake it, but it's not really the same. Disperser here is a weird all-pass effect, and I'm not going to go into the details on all-pass filters and stuff here, but what you need to know is this. I'm going to play that same set of kick drums here that sound kind of boring. And we're going to bring in disperser here and see what it does. So, disperser messes with audio in a pretty interesting way. You can also add the pinch here to really dial it in, and you can get these really funky kind of laser zapping effects. Or we can go a bit more subtle and just use it to add some weight to things. Another example of disperser in action here, that same funky bass line. Let's bring it in. So we can use it to enhance the bass. Does a really good job. Or we can go up and get some really weird characters and stuff out of different sounds. So really fun plugin to mess around with, and especially if we just really overdo the amount and start to modulate this. You can get some really, really weird sounds, especially as you start stacking a couple instances of this and modulating them and stuff like that. Or again, use it in a much more restrained fashion just to bring up a bit of character out of a certain frequency range or enhance the bass. It's great on just about anything, really. You know, anything that needs some low end, disperser. Things that need to sound a bit weird, disperser. Things that you want to have kind of a wet dog fart effect, disperser. One more example, that same vital sequence from earlier here. And I'm just going to start duplicating this out a couple times. We'll mess with these. So before and after. And that is disperser. It's a really weird effect, and it's pretty cool and pretty useful. It's a lot of fun to get goofy with, but it's also really nice just to add some weight and movement to things without totally futzing up the low end a whole bunch. It's a great bass enhancer, it's a great goofifier, and it's a great mess things up beyond all recognition machine, and I think it's super worth checking out at only $59. Next up, I've got two plugins from Callum or Calum Audio. I'm not totally sure how to pronounce that, but hey, I tried. I've got Tape Pro here, which comes in at $50, which is a tape simulator and also a pretty useful and pretty good sounding delay, and Schlap, which comes in at only $20, and it's a compressor that's designed to make things Schlap. Tape Pro is a pretty useful all-around tape plugin. It does everything from nice, clean enhancement to your master, to really crunchy, aggressive, distorted tape, to totally destroyed cassette crapifying and whatnot, to even being a really nice character delay. I'm going to run some drums into Tape Pro here, and we're going to flick through a couple presets and see how it sounds. So this is the drums totally dry. Bring in Tape Pro. Let's go through a couple presets. Let's just really crunch it up here. Let's try some of the other distortions. Let's try it out with a couple of the delay presets. So now let's try out a couple of the delay presets. So once again, this is dry. Let's bring in the dry signal. This is with Tape Pro. Just the delay here. So I think Tape Pro is really money well spent. It's pretty useful, it sounds really good, and it does kind of that little bit of tape magic very well. It's useful for, like I said, everything from enhancing the master bus, just making things a little more substantial and meaty sounding, or as a really interesting dub delay effect, or as a total crunchy destroyer thing, or just a general saturator. It's a pretty good all-around tool that does a lot of different things very well. That brings us to Schlap here, which is a compressor that makes things schlap. Let's bring this in. I'm gonna remove Schlap here, bring in our drums, and hear it again. Totally dry. Bring in Schlap. Right away, just really nice crunch. Let's drive the input really hard. So we get a bit of color and bite there. And let's just absolutely smash this. So we've gone from to. This also does more than just compression. If we bring it back up here. Here I've got it in negative mode. So that's before and after. So really what's going on there is it's lifting up the stuff between when the compressor would be acting. So it's a compressor but backwards, which is really, really interesting. It can also act as an expander as well. So if we bring this back in, we can drop the ratio down to below 1, so we could do like 0.5 to 1. And start to use this as kind of a transient shaper. So this is pretty dry. Bring it in. And personally, I find that function very, very useful on things like drum breaks or whatever, if I just need to tighten up a sound. And I like that this compressor doesn't have too many controls. It's really straightforward, but it also acts as an expander, and it also acts in that weird reverse compressor way, which can be kind of fun to experiment with things on like synth pads or weird washy reverbs or drum breaks or vocals or whatever you want to try it on, because that reverse mode can really add some interesting lift and detail to some kind of tiny characteristics that you might not hear from the sound otherwise. And that is Tape Pro and Schlap from Callum or Calum Audio. And one of the developers from Callum or Calum Audio is also a fan of the channel. So a big howdy doody to that there, buckaroonie. I think both of these are really worth checking out. Tape Pro is really useful for a lot of different things, from just adding some heat and grit to things to totally destroying them to adding some cool dubbed out vibey delay. And Schlap is really good to make things schlap. This next one's kind of a fun plugin. This is Akoustic from SampleSun, or SampleSun, I don't really know how to say it. But this is a spectral synthesizer. What does that mean? It is an additive synth, so this uses the individual harmonic partials to generate a sound. This is a really interesting plugin and is capable of producing a lot of interesting sounds. Let's kind of flick through a couple of presets here and you'll get an idea. So this is a one partial template, more or less a sine wave, 30 partials. We've got, let's do a electric piano. Let's try glass. Steel guitar. Water drop, why not? Couple acoustic models, how about a flute? Marimba. Sounds pretty good. Let's maybe do the tines. Very, very cool synth. A lot of different presets here to play with. Let's try one of these marimbas. So SampleSun I want to do kind of a separate video on because they're a very interesting independent plugin company, but this in particular I think is one of the most inspiring instruments that they make. What's cool about this is we can start messing with the individual partials to design something interesting. So down here in the bottom, we get access to the additive synth engine. We can increase or decrease the gain of the individual partials. So let's just start designing something random here. So I'm gonna start off by messing with this. Let's turn off the ring mod, turn off the reverb, and I'm gonna get rid of the noise for right now, as well as the releases. So here we've got kind of a random additive spectrum of 30 different partials. So I guess that's maybe kind of like a keys thing. It almost sounds like metal. I don't know. Offset, let's offset these. So we're offsetting the time. Let's try that. That's starting to get interesting. Let's adjust the attack of a couple of these. We'll make some of them come in a bit slower. So now we're starting to get more metallic. Decay, so we can adjust the decay of the partials. Sustain. Release. The tuning, so we can detune these just a little bit. Let's bring in the ring mods. Bring in some noise. And from a bunch of sine waves we have created a really interesting key sound. I don't know. And that's why I think this thing is so cool. It's maybe not the deepest synth in the world, and it doesn't do a whole lot other than what you see here, but it is incredibly inspiring to mess around with. I think it makes some super cool sounds that are great to sample and mess with and manipulate, or just use it as it is, add some effects, and go on. This one comes in really cheap at only $69, and I think is absolutely worth checking out. So I think I want to do a video on some of their other plugins here in the future, but Samples and Akoustic, absolutely go check this thing out and give it a whirl because it's a lot of fun to mess with. Next up here, two really awesome plugins from Unfiltered Audio, Triad here and Lion here. These come in at $299 and $199 respectively. And I know what you're saying. Whoa, dude, this is a cheap plugins video and that's not cheap. But I picked up both of these for less than $30 each. You can get these on Plugin Alliance, and Plugin Alliance has sales like all the time. Really, their emails are annoying how many sales they have. So there's a coupon that comes out every once in a while where you can get any plugin for $29, and that's what I used to pick up both of these. So if you sign up for the mailing list for Plugin Alliance, you can get these for super, super cheap, and they're absolutely worth checking out. First up, let's talk about Triad. This is probably the more interesting out of these two in my opinion, and I think if you pick one of them, this should probably be it. Triad is a modular effects unit where you can design some really weird, interesting things. It's a multi-band effects unit, so we've got 3-band mode, 2-band mode where we get 2 bands and then a post band, 3 bands in parallel, 2 in parallel, mid, side, and left, right. Now, Triad does a whole lot that is well beyond what I can cover in this video, but in short, if we crack open another effect here, so we've got 3 different lanes. We've got everything. We've got a bunch of delays, we've got distortions, dynamics processors, filters, granular stuff, mixing stuff, modulation, and reverbs. There are a ton of different presets as well that show just about everything that this thing can do, and really, even if you never sit down and design an effect with Triad, just the presets alone are well worth the money if you can grab this thing on sale. So I've got Akoustic open below this, just one of the kind of standard sounds. Not super interesting, but I'm gonna mix in Triad here. Drop it down a bit to 50% or so. Let's flick through a couple of presets. So I think you get the idea. You could put this on anything. You could put this on synths, on drums, on vocals, on whatever. You could flick through presets and really never find the end of all the cool things you can do with this. You can also even just randomize it, which is wild. But what's cool is it just randomizes what's already there, so it doesn't get too wild and ridiculous. So if we found a preset we liked, like maybe the, I believe it was the sparkly thing here. That's really cool. We could randomize it though. And quickly kind of iterate on some ideas and expand the presets into something new. You can also go in and design your own stuff as mentioned, so we can click down here to add anything. Adding modulation is super easy. There's even macro controls, so we can add macros to stuff. We can add more modulation. So in terms of modulation, we've got a whole bunch of stuff. We've got analyzers, controllers, envelopes, LFOs, modifiers, random sources, and sequencers. It is an absolutely insane plugin, and I think really it's worth the asking price. But again, if you find this on sale, absolute no-brainer. Next up is Lion. This is a synthesizer from Unfiltered Audio. So it looks very similar to Triad, but this is a synth. It even features some of the same stuff from Triad, so all the effects are in here. If we crack open the effects section, we've got everything we would have access to there, but within the synth. Very similar structure, so if we look around on the bottom here, we've got inputs, MIDI inputs. We can use the MIDI input to modify stuff going on in the synth. We've got macro controls. It's also MPE supportive, so if you have an MPE controller, you can design some absolutely ridiculous stuff inside of Lion. We've got the modulators as well here, so same list. We've got analyzers, controllers, blah, 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 blah. Bunch of different oscillator types. So we've got classic oscillators, FM, stacks, granular. The granular ones are really interesting. I don't totally understand them really, but they're very, very cool. It's not a granular synth, but it's like a granular oscillator. It's kind of hard to explain. Experimental, simple, and noise. There are a ton of different controls. This is the crossfade mode. It also does ring mod and whatnot. Filters, there's a bunch to choose from. Clipper, so we've got a distortion there on the end, which is really nice. And then an absolute ass load of effects. And then we could add even more envelopes and whatever. It's a very cool synth. Let's take a listen to some of the sounds. Lion is a super cool synth. It doesn't do a whole lot compared to some of the other synthesizers out there, but what it does do is really fun to mess with the randomization, a lot of great presets, and a lot of flexible stuff that you can use to design some really interesting sounds. So if you can find this one on sale, definitely recommend picking it up. Finally, to cap this video off, two really amazing plugins from Audio Damage, Replicant 2 and Automaton, and I've talked about these a ton on the channel, but really worth mentioning in this video because they're very cheap and incredibly useful. I use these things way too much because it takes making glitches and interesting stuff and makes it really easy, because doing things manually for glitchy, effects and whatnot is cool, but man, is it incredibly tedious. First up, Replicant 2 here. This is a sequencer type thing. So it goes around this ring and we can select certain beats to have it do its thing on, or we can leave it to chance with the randomization, or we could even combine the two. So we could select given steps and then add a little bit of randomness, which is what I usually use it for. It can also be controlled via MIDI to trigger this stuff manually. Stutter and repeat effects, we can randomize those as well, just to get some extra movement and crispiness and interest. We can pan them out to get this nice, wide, glitchy stuff, and this would take forever to do manually. And then we've got the bit crusher and stuff that, like, doing that manually would just be insanely stupid and time consuming. Also a filter, very useful, so we can just kind of have some high-end glitchy stuff or some filtered resonant, high pass, low pass glitchy stuff. Multiple modes as well. We can have it mix, which is what I usually use it on, duck, which ducks it out of the way, and send, so we can use this on a send. We've got the volume output control here, decay control, which allows you to decay the glitchy stuff over time, which is really useful, so it's not just full beans in your ears all the time, and then the bit crusher. So I'm going to demonstrate both of these at once here because I feel like these kind of need to be heard in context, but that is the overview of Replicant 2. Automaton here is based on this cellular sequencer, which is based on the Game of Life, if you know what that is. So this, if I just give this a play, you'll see it move around here and create all sorts of pretty patterns and whatnot. This includes a lot of the same stuff as Replicant, but also does some stuff very differently. Namely, we can insert points in this grid, and whenever one of these cells is covering that point, it's going to trigger that effect. So we've got stutter, modulate, bit crush, and replicate, each of those with some fine controls as well as some additional randomness. We can have this run as a sequence over given time, so we can have this reset every 4 measures. We can set the lifespan of each of those little grid points. We can change the rule set, so it can be Game of Life, sequencer, replicator, serviettes, I've never used that mode, and gnarl. So usually I just leave this on Game of Life because it's really random and interesting sounding. Wrapping, we can have this pan around and move. Density, we can control the density of the grid, and then we've got controls to clear it. On the master side, we can set this in mix, duck, or send mode. We can bypass it, and then we can adjust the output for the master output and the effects level. So to hear all of this in context, I'm gonna open up this mix here, and I'm gonna bypass all of that. Now, what you are going to hear is going to be a combination of Replicant and Automaton on this drum bus. So right now, if we take a listen to these drums, pretty cool, but maybe a little bit boring because it's just the same loop over and over and over. And if we listen to this in context with the track, it's neat, but it doesn't really evolve or grow as this stuff kind of should. Let's turn that down for a second. So I'm going to turn on Replicant and Automaton here. So what I've got set up is a couple different instances of Replicant and one instance of Automaton. So on the drum bus, I've got Replicant feeding into an Automaton. On this mutated drum groove loop, I've got an instance of Replicant here. So this has some different settings on it. And then on the 16th note hi-hats, I have another instance of Replicant. And as you can see, everything here is a little bit different. So this provides some very interesting and very detailed glitchy textures and movement. So let's give this another play. But I'm not doing anything. There's no automation, nothing like that. It's all just doing its thing. And since it's random, if I shut up and we listen, it's never the same. There's always movement. So that allows me to take a very boring drum loop and turn it into something very intricate and detailed, but without doing a whole bunch of work on my end, which is awesome because I'm kind of super lazy. So if we take another listen to that in context with the track here. Just sounds super, super awesome and makes adding that glitchy, detailed IDM texture and whatever super, super simple. This also sounds great on leads. It also sounds great on vocals. It sounds good on ARPs. It sounds good on whatever you want to put it on, and is a really easy way to add some cool glitchy movement to your music with pretty much no effort at all, which I think is amazing. And that wraps everything up for this one. Those are some of my favorite super cheap plugins that I think you should absolutely go pick up if you've got a little bit of cash lying around, because I think all of these will really add something interesting to your setup and bring something new to the table without being a huge investment. I'd also like to take a minute just to quickly thank the developers of these plugins. I mean, plugins are really expensive, and I, like a lot of musicians, don't have a ton of money to blow on these things. So being able to access tools that are this high quality for not a huge investment and not needing to sell one of my organs is really awesome. So big shout out to the developers of the world for allowing goons like me to access this kind of stuff without breaking the bank. What are some of your favorite cheap plugins? Be sure to leave those down in the comments below. That wraps everything up for this one, so thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys again soon.